Super. So hi, my name's Mark. I am a data manager, research data manager at the University of the Arts in London. I'm actually very new to the post. I only started about 9 weeks ago. Before I worked for the University of the Arts, my entire career for the past 20 years has been in epidemiology. Particularly medical statistics. So as you can imagine, coming over to the arts has been extremely different. I keep saying to people, I've never actually had a job I was interested in before, and now I have. It goes down well at my new job. I don't tell them at my old jobs, that's what I think. But it's true, because in my old job, basically all of our data was data sets. It was almost all quantitative, and almost all of our outputs, well, all of our outputs were the traditional, either a paper, a conference poster or a book section. Now it is very different. In the arts where I am now, we get things like this. I'm going to talk about 2 different case studies. This is the first one. This is the RCOCO project, which stood for Remote Cooperation and Communication. Very similar to Emma's actually, the stuff we had to work with. The project was run by Professor Stephen Scrivener at Chelsea College of Arts and Design in the early 1990s. It was a project to look at the amazing futuristic possibility of designers working together remotely on design projects, using computer-based drawing tools to work on projects together. And the data from this project was this pile of old VHS videotapes. They're recordings of the project, which it was looking at ways to use computerized sketch pads for designers to work together on the same project, communicating via video cameras and microphones and computers at remote sites. The results of this were filmed from different angles on different cameras at different sites, as you can see here. And then the way they worked together was analysed from this. So the data from this study was not what I was used to of actual data sets or spreadsheets or whatever. It was boxes and boxes and boxes of smelly, dusty old VHS videotapes. So these all sat in an office at Central St Martin's for several years and were eventually discovered by some of our repository staff there. There were over 250 of these videotapes, none of them indexed in any way whatsoever. There were handwritten labels, as you can see, some written in pen here, much like you might do if you do your taping at Christmas in olden times. And that was it. So they weren't linked in any way, and all the labels were done differently. So in order to create this nice, the quad effect as they called it, so each one of these films is taken from 4 different videotapes. And what the repository staff had to do was look through all of the tapes and use trial and error to work out which ones went with each other. So there would always be 4 that were together, but there was no labelling, indexing. They weren't even in the same boxes kept together. So it was a massive job to do. There are about, I think, 250 of these videotapes which needed sorted out. So they were grouped. Yes, that's right. Yes, sorry, I've gone a bit too far. That's a bit of a spoiler just there. There we go. Yeah, so this was done by post-elimination. They were digitised in real time, apparently, into MOV files, each of which took around 20 gigabytes per hour for these 250 different videotapes. So these were then downsampled, again in real time, to MP4 files. So the MP4 files took about 1 gigabyte per hour. So it's the issue of storage space, which I think as already spoken about. Again, this was a big saving on space, but there were about, altogether, when everything's put together, about 200 hours of material just for this one project, making about 200 gigabytes of data storage that we needed. And storage space was one of the considerations that we had to deal with on this project. Now, you've already seen this. I do like this as an example of how archiving and preservation doesn't work. This is the Domesday Project. Some of you may even remember it from school or whatever. This was a project done in 1986 by the BBC, where they got millions of people all over the country, including lots and lots of school children, to gather data for a 900th anniversary version of the Domesday Book. It was very, very modern. It was all recorded on laser discs, if you can imagine anything more modern than that, and it was put onto a BBC home computer. The upshot of which was 25 years later, the original Domesday Book was still accessible. This was almost completely inaccessible. Most of the discs had deteriorated. I think there were only 4 in the whole country that were still working. And of course, the BBC Micro, well, it wasn't quite as omnipresent in school classrooms as it was when it was first done. And I use this as an illustration about some of the problems that come with archiving non-traditional data, and especially computer data, demonstrating, as I think we were talking about earlier, the need for data to be transportable and to use non-proprietary formats so it can remain available for future researchers. In order to facilitate this sort of thing, in our case, we uploaded it to our data repository. Now, at UAL, we have both a data repository and a data depository. The data depository is where we put most of our outputs, so there's videos of performances and things like that. The repository is a little bit less populated. What we're trying to do with the repository is to put all the background data for the research we do. And again, as Emma was saying, in the arts, a lot of people don't think of themselves as researchers. A lot of our practice-based practitioners are performers, and so it's sort of, again, we have the same issue as well, where we're talking to people and saying, this is research, we need to archive the data that you're using to generate it. And we put it on the repository so that, again, it will hopefully be available for future researchers with metadata, with abstracts all attached to it. Future-proofing. And talking of the future, my second case study is this one. This is VRchway. It is a pun. It's an artwork by Dom Biddulph, and it's a virtual walkthrough of the Byam Shaw School of Art in Archway, hence VRchway. It was the first born digital artwork that we collected at Central St Martin's. That is an artwork that was created digitally and went through its entire life cycle as a digital piece, rather than anything physical at all. It was collected, it was added to the collection, so it was our first born digital. It was added to our collection in the summer last year, and by Christmas it was completely out of date. In the course of 5 or 6 months, the software had been updated twice, so it was no longer backward compatible with the version that it was created on, and the hardware was obsolete. Now, this sort of thing happens a lot in the world of VR at the moment, because everything about it is changing so very fast. This happens with all developing technologies, of course. Everything's changing so quickly that there's no agreement on formats. Everything being made is unique, and there's no cross-platform compatibility of any kind, and often no backwards compatibility with the technology as it moves forward. I've used this part of our computer leads to typify this. I don't know if anybody else, I say my background is in computing from years ago. It always used to be basically a day's work to set up a computer, because you had to find all the right leads that were, before they were even colour coded, to find all the right leads to fit in the right sockets to join everything together. And then USB came along, the USB protocol came along, which made everything a lot easier, because you can just use one lead for basically everything. And that is the problem we're facing with VR at the moment. Nothing fits with anything else. Another problem is that it's proprietary, so you can't even get the code to examine it, because it's owned by these companies. And that means that a lot of the material risks being lost forever, because like the Domesday Project, these things go out, these things pass away, nobody's doing them anymore, and then suddenly nobody knows how to do it anymore. This happens a lot, especially when things are being created by the smaller companies, because they obviously don't have the time or the money to archive what they're doing, and they're also much more likely to go out of business much quicker. And of course, in a lot of the cutting edge results, it's these very small companies that are doing most of the stuff that we're using. So it's very, very difficult to keep track of it all. Another problem, I talked to Judy Wilcox, who is our head of museum and study collections, and she said the big problem they face is that the people who are doing a lot of this VR work are young people, they're young artists. So when she goes to them and says, you need to archive this, because in 10 years' time, your back catalogue will be completely inaccessible and unusable, they do not give a toss. For them, 10 years is a distant time they do not care about, and they assume that all their art can be here today and gone tomorrow. They won't feel like that in 10 years' time, of course, and it needs to be archived. Anyway, so what we're doing at UAL, we are looking at 2 different ways of preserving things. One is parsimonious preservation. I've used the box of Lego with instructions for this one, because that's what it sounded like to me. This is where we try and assemble all of the key data for a project. So in VR, I think we use TIFFs as one of the graphic pieces. They use meshes, data sets. We collect all that information that we have and a statement of intent from the artist, so we know what they're doing. So the hope is we preserve that in a format that can be reaccessed as I think Judy at CSM said, in the hope of better days. So that if we ever need to be able to recreate this, we will have all the material there that will allow us to do it. The second way of doing this, which has always been mentioned, is virtual machines. This is, some of you may remember, this is a Lords of Midnight and a ZX Spectrum, which is done on a virtual computer on the internet. It's amazing that a computer that was so advanced when I was using it, Christmas 1982, is now, it's only 16, well this is 48K of memory, which just goes like that on the internet. You can download it almost immediately. And what we do with digital virtual machines is we recreate the original environment so we can actually run the code as near to what it originally was as possible. Now, when it's thousands of hobbyists doing it, as it is with the old home computers, that's fine. But it does take a long time to do this, especially when you're having to do it anew for every single project. And again, with VR, because it changes so quickly, every project will be different and will run on different code, which is fine for sort of the big players, like the Tate, for instance, are looking at virtual machines and doing that for art projects. But even they only have the time and money to do 1 or 2 a year. So lots and lots of stuff is being lost forever. And of course, they don't preserve the full experience of using the artwork. So in the case of if you use a virtual machine for virtual reality, what you lose is the experience of wearing the headset, for instance. Or if you're using an old home computer like this, you can use the experience of using the tiny little old rubber keyboards you used to have. And that is part of the experience, which even then gets lost. So in order to look at ways to deal with this, again, our Museum of Study collections head is looking at talking with other groups, because we can't all do it on our own, and it's something that affects all of us. So she's looking at ways to find an answer. One thing that we're doing is we're talking to the Tate and the DPC about arranging an event next year where we're going to get makers and creators to get together with curators, because not only does it rhyme, it's also quite a nice way of getting everybody together to see what everybody's doing and to examine what we think is coming in the future, so we prepare for what's to come. We're also working with organisations like the ACMA in Australia, Rhizome in New York, HEK in Basel, and BFI to work towards sort of getting a working group together to deal with this. Looking towards getting, I think, what Judy at CSM calls a PDF for VR, something that we can all use and deal with together on a common format. It's not going to happen immediately because obviously everything is developing so quickly, but it's at least knowing that that's the route means we could hope for a solution in the future. And in conclusion to this, like Buck Rogers in the 25th century, it's great working at an arts university because you get to look at things like this, which I never got away with when I worked in cancer research. I can see that. Like Buck Rogers in the 25th century, we come from the past to a future that we don't understand. But the best we can do in data management, in the arts, and obviously in other areas, is prepare for that. We know it's going to be challenging, but if we're prepared to be challenged, at least we're going part of the way there. Thank you.
Well, I'm now tempted to ask lots of questions about Buck Rogers on the 25th century. With all those questions, any kind of immediate questions there?
Hi.
I was really interested in your thoughts about these preservations.
Yeah.
That's a sort of a neat term that I've come across before in the National Archives. Could you just explain a little bit more from your Lego box sort of approach?
Well, I think, as I understand it, it's simply the idea that we're gathering as much together that made up the project as we possibly can. It is like a Lego box. It's here are all the materials that we used to create this, and then it's basically an instruction set about how you go about doing it. I think it's similar to how when we have artists doing installations, the artist doesn't necessarily come in and set the installation up themselves, especially if it's a touring installation. They just supply the materials they used to put up the installation, and then a detailed guide to where everything should hang on a wall or the sound systems to be used. So it is basically an instruction set. Obviously, it's more difficult with VR because there's proprietary technology involved in that. So anything that we can persuade the artist to take out of it, such as the artwork, which does come, as I understand it, in non-proprietary formats, then it's doing basically it's hoping for the best in a lot of cases. It's doing the best we possibly can to try and hope that somebody in the future will be able to remake it.